Vaše presveštenstvo, dragi prijatelji, dragi gosti, dobrodošli na završnu sesiju ovogodišnjeg petog po redu simpozijona Teologija u javnoj sferi, koji će, kao što znate, biti okončan centralnim, odnosno glavnim predavanjem profesora Aristotela Papanikolaova, na temu koju vidite ovdje, jedan hrišćanski sekularizam. Pre nego što se samim predavanjem počnemo, ja ću vam samo nekoliko reći o našem večerašnjem predavaču. Aristotel Papanikolaou rođen je i odrastao u Čikagu, osnovne studije završio je na Univerzitetu Kulturni 1988. godine, magistarski na časnom krstu u Bostonu 1991. a doktorski na Univerzitetu u Čikagu 1997. godine. On je profesor teologije i šef katedre arhijepiskopa Dimitrija za pravoslavnu teologiju i kulturu na Univerzitetu Kulturni u Sjedinjenim Američkim Državama. Također, jedan je od direktora Centra za pravoslavne hrišćanske studije na istom univerzitetu, kao i viši naučni saradnik Centra za studije prava i religije na Emory univerzitetu. Njegovo uže interesovanje uključuje teologiju i političku teologiju, a u posljednje vrijeme naročito proučava vezu između teološke antropologije, nasilja i etike vrlina. 2012. godine dobio je priznanje za izuzetno predavačko umeće na osnovnim studijama u oblasti komunistike. Autor je više knjiga, među kojima možemo pomenuti Mističko kao političko, Demokratija i neradikalno pravoslavlje iz 2012. godine i knjigu Biti sa Bogom, Svete Trojice Apofatika i Bogočovečanska zajednica iz 2006. godine, koja je na srpski jezik prevedena upravo u okviru eparhije Zapadno-hercegovačke i Primorske. 2017. godine profesor Papanikolaou osnovao je i međunarodni interdisciplinarni časopis za pravoslavne hrišćanske studije. Professor Papanikolaou, welcome once again. It is a privilege and pleasure to have you among us. We are all eager to hear your lecture, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's really a great honor to be here. I was especially pleased to receive the invitation because, of course, I know that you have, amongst all the Orthodox people, the best hierarchy in the region.
Hvala vam, velika je čast biti ovdje i posebno sam bio počastvovan pozivom zbog toga što znam da od svih pravoslavnih naroda imate najbolju rakiju u čitavom regionu.
But I've also heard of the great and dynamic ministry of His Eminence, Bishop Grigorije. And so again, I'm very honored and very pleased to be here and in this part of the Balkans.
Još jednako, bravo sam počastvovan i srećan što sam ovdje i zahvalan Vladiki Grigorije na njegovom pozivu.
So the word secular is not a good word for Christians. It is associated mostly with a society that attempts to eliminate religion or keep it privatized out of the public space, which includes politics, government, and culture. It has been associated primarily with Western liberal thought that is viewed primarily as atheistic. In the Orthodox world in particular, it is very common to hear Orthodox theologians speak against the godless secularism of the West. In fact, there are Christian theologians and even non-Christian atheist academics in the West who are now criticizing secularism. Some are even declaring that we live in a post-secular world. But such a declaration ultimately depends on how we define the word secular. If you look at the history of the development of the word secular, it was first used to indicate our time on earth before the second coming and eschatological fulfillment of the world. It then came to mean, primarily in the Latin West, the clergy as opposed to the monastic orders. The logic being that the clergy dealt with the everyday matters while the monks focused exclusively on matters that pertain to the kingdom of God. After the Reformation, the secular started to become associated with those matters that had nothing to do with the church, such as state matters. The new Protestant societies were obviously not anti-religious, but they did want to make a distinction between the church which was constituted by those justified by faith, and the everyday areas of life, mainly the politia, which was constituted by those who were justified and not justified, and which was the arena where the Christian does good works that do not merit salvation. The point here, simply, is that the secular started to be associated with that part of society in which those saved Christians and those not saved, which included those who professed Christianity and non-Christians, were to live together, and in which the saved Christians played an important role. Religion obviously was very important in Protestant societies at that time, but we do see in the Reformation some of the distinctions that would play a key role in later Western political thinking, such as the separation of church and state, even if Luther and Calvin would reject the situation as it exists today in many Western societies. After the Enlightenment, the word secular started increasingly to mean a society in which religion would not influence politics and government. There would be freedom of religious belief and practice, but religion should be practiced privately without any influence on politics, government, and culture. And eventually, there was a prediction that with the advancement of science, industrial modernization, technology, that religion would no longer be needed, that people would eventually stop believing, and religion would be eliminated, except for a few extreme believers. Where are we today? When people hear the word secular, their imagination takes them mostly to the West, where religion seems either to be non-existent or to be marginalized and privatized. But if we look closely at the Western countries, religion is very alive and well. So those that predicted that Western societies will become secular in the sense that religion will be eliminated were clearly wrong. And not even Western atheist academics argue that religion will be eliminated as a result of modernization or scientific and technological advancement. It is, however, the case that religion is privatized in some Western countries, so Western European countries, meaning that it must be practiced without any influence on politics or government and even culture. The most extreme example is in France, where the privatization of religion is seen as necessary for the sake of securing freedom. And of course, France is well known for not allowing people to publicly wear religious clothing, such as a headscarf, or even to visibly display a cross in the workplace. France, however, is an exception, as religion plays a public role in most Western European societies, including the United States. In many Northern European societies, even though religious participation is low, the official Lutheran churches still play an important social role in those societies, which most citizens support. In the United States, it is very clear that religion still plays a very important public role, especially in politics, both in elections and even in legislation on controversial issues. So if we mean by secular the privatization of religion, not all Westerners think alike about this privatization, and it is clear that religion plays a very public role, even if it is different depending on the particular country. So when Orthodox say that the West is secular, in the sense of trying to advance atheism and attempting to eliminate religion, this is not quite accurate, and as a result can be reduced to mere rhetoric. But clearly, there is something different about the role of religion than what was once the case in pre-modern societies. If European societies are secular in some way, that does not necessarily mean the elimination of religion or even the privatization of religion. How exactly are Western societies secularized? In pre-modern societies, religion was what we may call the all-encompassing reality. In pre-modern societies, everyone believed in the supernatural. And the belief in the supernatural was important to understanding the other aspects of society, such as politics and government in law and culture, in science and education. Religion was everywhere. After the Reformation, but especially after the American and French revolutions, all these other areas of society started to separate themselves from religion. So there was church-state separation, but also culture, economics, science, and education started to develop independently of religion. The separation of religion from these parts of society was not simply promoted by influential atheists such as Karl Marx. It also happened as a result of the scientific revolution, where it was seen that scientific advancement could occur without religion. When asked by Napoleon why God was missing from his new book on physics, Pierre Laplace famously replied, "I have no need of that hypothesis." If I may be a bit technical for a moment, scholars call this understanding of the secular the differentiation thesis. And it is used simply to describe the historical phenomenon where the various parts of society no longer rely on religion for their meaning. Religion stops becoming the all-encompassing reality. There no longer is a common theological perspective shared by all members of society. In this historical phenomenon, we start seeing the emergence of a rejection of the supernatural. We see unbelief becoming an option. We see emphasis on the autonomy of the individual. We see the elevation of human rights as a way of protecting the individual from the power of government, and we see that the religious way of understanding the cosmos no longer influences the various parts of society, such as politics, government, law, education, science, and economics and culture. It is not the case that religion stops playing a role in society, nor is it the case that this differentiation leads to the elimination of morality, even if the morality of a society is not the same as the morality of a specific religion. Religion still plays a role in society, but it is a different role. The hard question for Christians, and especially for Orthodox Christians, is what role should religion play in society, where religion is not the all-encompassing reality, where orthodoxy is not the common theological perspective of all citizens. There also was another effect of this third meaning of the secular, and that is pluralism. If this third meaning of secular means to simply to describe, not predict or dictate, that religion has a different role in society, that it no longer determines the meaning of the various parts of society or the reason for why they function in society, then one of the effects of this secularization is the emergence of pluralism in a society. Now, there always existed pluralism, even in pre-modern empires and societies. Secular pluralism, however, means that no one can be placed in a position of being a second-class citizen in a society as a result of who they are, as the Orthodox were second-class citizens under the Ottomans, or the Jews were second-class citizens under the Byzantine Empire. Secular in this meaning does not mean the elimination of religion or the forced privatization of religion. It means the acceptance of a pluralistic society in such a way that never existed in pre-modern societies and empires. In my opinion, though many Orthodox like to criticize the West for promoting a secular society that is atheistic, immoral, and trying to eliminate religion, this criticism is simply rhetoric, because that kind of secular society rarely exists anywhere in the world. In fact, the clearest example we have of an atheistic, anti-religious society was former Soviet-style communism, which often contrasted itself against the religious West. What the Orthodox should really focus on, and what they should be discussing more often, is whether the Orthodox can accept what I would call a Christian secularism, that accepts the fact that religion now has, for various historical reasons, a different role in society, and that accepts the presence of a pluralistic society whose citizens are protected by laws affirming their rights and freedoms. The Orthodox have never really had to confront this question, except for a short time in the late 19th century and early 20th century in Russia. Such discussions are evident in the writings of Vladimir Solovyov and Sergius Bulgakov, just to name a few Russian theologians of that period. Otherwise, the Orthodox have had to contend with Ottoman occupation and the communist occupation. It was only after the fall of communism that the Orthodox had to confront questions regarding democratic secularism. It was clear that the Orthodox would reject any understanding of secular that meant elimination of religion or privatization of religion. But what is unclear is how the Orthodox stand on the question of pluralism. In most Orthodox countries, formerly under communism, an attempt was made to reinstall a kind of sinfonia model, where the Orthodox Church would have a privileged position within a particular country and try to work in harmony with the state. There was also an attempt to reestablish the link between ethnic and Orthodox identity, such that even if one were an atheist, one could still be considered to be Orthodox by being a Greek or a Serb or a Russian. There does not exist an Orthodox country in the world that rejects democracy, but Orthodox struggle to define what this democracy entails, as the Orthodox also try to secure Orthodoxy's privileged place in an Orthodox country through legislation on various issues and through education in the public schools. The Orthodox, on the one hand, accept democracy, but on the other hand seem to reject a pluralism that might endanger their privileged place within a particular society. One could say that the Orthodox are trying to maintain orthodoxy as the common theological perspective of the society, which, if true, would minimize the reality of pluralism. In other words, Orthodox are attempting to affirm democracy, but reject secularism in all three of its forms. But can one have democracy without affirming secularism as pluralism? The attempt to accept democracy while rejecting secularism as pluralism is particularly evident in Russia. In Russia, this privileging has intensified since 2011, when a noticeable shift becomes evident such that references by politicians to the spiritual foundations in the history of Russia would become more explicit. Russia's Orthodox history is being mentioned in order to project a Russia that is not anti-democratic, but one that allows for a public role of religion, and in that sense exists in opposition to the godless, liberal kind of democracy that is claimed to be represented in the West. Both political and religious actors in Russia have formed alliances with certain American evangelical representatives over a shared concern of the erosion of traditional values. In fact, Russia looks a lot like what American evangelicals hope for in the US, a legally supported moral framework that centers around sexual ethics, including laws against so-called gay propaganda and proposed laws that could restrict abortion, but which also restrict freedom of religious assembly, which ironically would affect American evangelicals. In a sense, the American culture wars have become globalized. And one could argue that the new Cold War, or geopolitical East-West divide, has been drawn on the basis of debates about what constitutes the secular. Said in another way, the Russian government has embraced the clash of civilizations thesis of the Harvard professor Samuel Huntington, and is using references to Orthodox culture, history, and theology to project a kind of civilization over and against that of the West, and one in which religion plays a key role. Recently, the Russian Orthodox Church issued a document on human rights that ultimately attempts to advance what may be called a particularist approach to human rights against the Western universalist understanding of human rights. Having clearly in mind the extension of human rights to the LGBTQ community in Western European countries and the US, the ROC is arguing for a notion of human rights that is linked with morality. The gist of the argument is that although each human being has a God-given dignity, rights should not be extended in such a way that conflict with morality, since the latter is what confers dignified life. It comes as no surprise then that the ROC would seek to deny rights that have, quote, legislative and public support given to various vices such as sexual lechery and perversion, but also to the worship of profit and violence, abortion, euthanasia, use of human embryos in medicine, experiments changing a person's nature and the like, end quote. A little more unusual is the ROC's claim that, quote, human rights should not contradict love for one's homeland and neighbors, end quote, which the ROC justifies by claiming that the, quote, Orthodox tradition traces patriotism back to the words of Christ, the Savior himself. Greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends, end quote. I recently learned that such an interpretation of this passage was also given by German Christians who supported the Nazis. The ROC amplifies by stating that, quote, one's human rights cannot be set against the values and interests of one's homeland, community, and family. The exercise of human rights should not be used to justify any encroachment on religious holy symbols, cultural values, and the identity of a nation, end quote. Such rights are excluded because for the ROC, in Orthodoxy, quote, there is an immutable conviction that in ordering its life, a society should take into account not only human interests and wishes, but also the divine truth, the eternal moral law given by the Lord and working in the world, no matter whether the will of particular people or people's communities agree with it or not, end quote. So the severing of rights from morality, according to the ROC, is a so-called Western colonial construct. And the ROC is arguing for an affirmation of human rights language, but interpreted within the particularistic morality of a given nature or culture. Such a document would not be big news, except for the fact that since 2012, the ROC is actively working with the Russian government to advance this particularistic approach to human rights in the UN Council of Human Rights. And they are doing so through a global alliance centered on the promotion of traditional values. The Russians have succeeded in forging a new East-West geopolitical divide. But this time, the dividing line is defined not in terms of communism versus capitalism, but in terms of traditional values versus the so-called godless liberalism. To summarize, what one sees today in the post-communist Orthodox world is an attempt to reject the secular as a neutral space that marginalizes religion and even attempts to eliminate it. It is motivated by fear that the kind of decline of religious participation and identification in the West will occur in these post-communist countries. And the fear, quite truthfully, is justified. But the Orthodox countries fear is a situation where not being religious is simply what is normal, and where national identity is no longer linked to religious identity. In Russia, for example, even though 90% identify now as Russian Orthodox, only 75% actually believe in God, and less than 5% attend religious services. According to a recent report by the Pew Research Center, the pattern is similar in most Orthodox countries. To be clear, in the West, one does not see hostility to religion as what is normal, as some Orthodox rhetorically proclaim, except perhaps in France. This characterization of the West as secular is simply inaccurate. But the West is secular in the sense that being religious is in decline, and the link between religion and nationalism is being severed. In the West, more and more are declaring being spiritual but not religious. The West is secular in the sense of that Western societies are no longer governed by a common theological perspective that shapes cultural and legal structures, and which attempt to secure religious pluralism, where all religions have a voice in the public political space. But again, it's very, very important to remember that if one means by secular an aggressive attempt to privatize religion and keep it silenced in the public political space, even to eliminate it, then this does not occur in the West, except perhaps in France. And thus we are not necessarily in a post-secular world. In most other Western countries, one can see a vibrant public religious presence, even if it is not taken seriously due to the decline of religious participation and identification. So given this framework, the diametrical opposition between an East that is religious and a secular West that tries to eliminate religion is a false one and simply used for rhetoric. Religion is alive in the West. However, insofar as the Orthodox churches are attempting to reinstate a kind of symphonia, where cultural, legal, and political life is shaped and influenced by a common Orthodox theological perspective, the Orthodox churches are rejecting secularism in all its different forms that I described above. This rejection is especially clear when the Orthodox churches declare that they can define human rights according to Orthodox history and theological tradition. I want to end by arguing that Orthodox rejection of the secular in all its forms is theologically unjustifiable. Said another way, I want to argue that the Orthodox should accept a Christian secularism, which is a public political space that maximizes pluralism and does not extend legal privileges to one religion over another. This type of secularism is one that doesn't emphasize church-state relations, but is defined as a public political space whose legal structures enable pluralism, especially religious pluralism. Though I am unfamiliar with the history of the territory in which I stand today and in which I am privileged to be, I think a Christian secularism in terms of pluralism is needed now more than ever. Yes, there are risks to a Christian secularism in the form of a weakened institutional church, the severing of national and religious identity. For example, to be Greek no longer means necessarily to be Orthodox. The decline in participation in religious services, and the erosion of what is clearly an Orthodox culture. But the only alternative is an orthodoxy that is enforced by the power of the state, and that is not theologically consistent with all that Orthodox say about God, Christ, Church, and the Anthropos. To restate briefly my argument given in my book, The Mystical as Political, if theosis is to become like God in union with God, and if God is love, then theosis entails loving as God loves in the world, including the stranger and the enemy. The Christian ascetical tradition understood well that humans do not love God with all heart, mind, and soul, and that such love is experienced through ascesis. Ascesis should not be immediately imagined as negative, as it could entail practices of truth-telling, attentive listening, moderation in relation to resources, and other practices that are not about self-flagellation. The goal ultimately is to gain self-knowledge on the sources that block experiencing God's love, such as anger, fear, and hatred, and the doing of practices that make one more available to experiencing this love, which then would constitute one as more loving toward the neighbor, including the enemy and the stranger. I have further argued that politics is a kind of ascesis. As I state in my book, The Mystical as Political, quote, if the Christian calling is to learn how to love, then an ascetics of divine human communion cannot be confined either to the monastery or to the church. The whole world is the field in which this ascetics must be played out. And if this learning how to love goes beyond family or other Christians and includes the neighbor, but may also be the stranger, then politics cannot be irrelevant to an ascetics of divine human communion. In fact, insofar as politics can be construed as an engagement with the neighbor or the stranger, then politics must be considered as one of the many practices within an ascetics of divine human communion. The political community is not the antithesis to the desert, but one of the many deserts in which the Christian must combat the demons that attempt to block the learning of love. In no other field is the temptation to demonize the neighbor more compelling or more seemingly justifiable than in the field of politics. In no other space than in the political then is the Christian more challenged to fulfill the commandment to love. If the Christian affirmation of the Incarnation points to what is possible for humans, that possibility involves what the 7th century Byzantine theologian St. Maximus the Confessor would describe as a learning how to love, which is a learning how to engage in the practices that would move one deeper into the life of God, whom the Christians have named as love. The relevance of this point for the issue of religion and democracy is that regardless of how we got to this present point in history, rather than seeing a Christian ontology of communion as diametrically opposed to modern liberalism, an ascetical perspective to communion would see the political space as one in which the Christian learns to love, insofar as that space is where one encounters the stranger, as well as the enemy, who seeks to destroy all that one cherishes as true and beautiful. As I said, one does not need to go to the desert to achieve theosis. The political space is indeed the desert where one battles the very demons that get in the way of divine human communion, such as the demons of fear, anger, hatred, which lead to projections and objectifications. The political space is indeed distinct from the ecclesial, especially as it is one that would allow, as one option among many, to turn to belief in the non-existence of God. But as seen through the perspective of the practices of divine human communion, or learning how to love, liberal democratic structures do not appear as foreign to a so-called ontology of communion. Indeed, engaged in practices of divine human communion, Christians would be actively shaping a political space structured around a minimal set of underdetermined normative principles that include freedom and equality, guaranteed through human rights language that is not linked to a specific religious morality, all while being aware that the ecclesial is not the political, even if, as I would argue, that the mystical is the political. The politics of theosis works to create political structures that would facilitate for all people the lived experience of personhood, which according to Metropolitan John Zizoulas is the lived experience of irreducible uniqueness, of being created in the image and likeness of God. To support, however, liberal democratic structures would mean to accept that the morality of the public political space would not be identical to that within the ecclesial public space, since the goal of the public political space is distinct from or analogous to that of the church as a shared communal space of worship. In order to create structures that would guarantee that all humans are treated as unique and irreducible, the Christian would work towards maximalizing pluralism, such that the public political space could not be such that it endorses the morality of a singular religious tradition, no matter the cultural history of that shared public political space. In working towards securing structures that guarantee that all humans are treated as unique and irreducible, the ascetical Christian, who is not simply the monk, is not accepting a public political space without morality, but is working toward a public political space that is shaped by a morality that exists as an overlapping consensus. Given this theological point, the Orthodox churches in the mother countries should not use the privilege of history or culture as a means to enforce necessarily legally particular moral positions of the Orthodox Church, especially if they publicly proclaim support for democratic structures. Churches should use the power of its public presence for promoting, furthering, and deepening the kinds of political structures that are most consistent with its own ecclesiological principles, or what should result when the church is a social ethic. One may call such structures democratic, but that is irrelevant to the point. The church simply cannot use the privilege of its cultural and historical positions to impose its morality on a shared, pluralistic public political space. I argue that the Christian's movement is from the Eucharist to the non-Eucharistic space of the political. It is Eucharistic ecclesiology, as analyzed by Metropolitan John Zizioulas, that can serve as a critique for any institutional political structures that do not iconically reflect the mutually constitutive dynamic of communion and otherness in the Eucharist. Furthermore, if the Orthodox Christian were to encounter this political space as one in which she engages in the Eucharistic ascesis of learning to love, especially the one who does not share her belief, or is even out to destroy this belief, then the Christian would work toward a legal and civic structures that ultimately are based on what I would call a liberal minimalism, which entail principles of freedom, equality, and pluralism. To argue that Eucharistic ecclesiology does not allow for such an integration of the ascetical is to create a false opposition between the Eucharist and the ascetical, and fails to see that the ascetical aims towards a Eucharistic mode of being, and that the Eucharist as an event of communion depends on the ascetical. After the Eucharist, the Christian must enter the world in such a way as to ascetically struggle to learn how to love in the face of another that does not share her orthodox presuppositions. This asceticism means that the faith is shared by persuasion and not by force, which means that the Orthodox Christian must inhabit a space with others who do not share her beliefs or presuppositions, a shared public political space. It would be important to emphasize that the language of human rights does not adequately express all that Orthodox theological anthropology asserts is possible for being human, all that Orthodoxy understands by the notion of the sacredness of the person. The public political space is indeed distinct from the ecclesial, especially as it is one that would allow as one option among many to turn to belief in the non-existence of God. But, as seen through the perspective of practices of divine human communion or learning how to love, liberal democratic structures do not appear as foreign to an Orthodox understanding of the human person. This does not mean that the Orthodox would accept what has been identified as a liberal anthropology of the autonomous self, excessive individualism, and infinitely incited consumerism. In fact, the Christian would also work toward a common good, constituted through a pluralism of voices that would mitigate against excessive individualism and consumerism, toward a relational self whose flourishing and irreducible uniqueness is constituted through an acknowledged dependence on the other. I argue against those who claim that political liberalism and a politics of the common good are mutually exclusive. In the end, a politics of theosis would affirm what I would call a Christian secularism, which does not entail an evacuation of religious voices from political life, but would entail a negation of a common theological perspective as a frame for legal and civic structures, and in order to secure a pluralism that affirms freedom and equality. We must resist the temptation to what I have called political Nestorianism. Although Nestorianism itself, and as a general trajectory, was concerned with preserving the full humanity of Jesus Christ for the sake of soteriology, it is also clear that there was an Arian-like concern to protect a certain understanding of the simplicity of God. Nestorianism did not deny union with the full divinity of God, but the union between the divine and the human was mediated by a third, a prosopon, whose status as divine or human was unclear. In the end, for Nestorianism, it was unthinkable for the divine to assume the created in all its finitude. Those two ontological planes, so to speak, simply cannot seep into each other. The critique of political democratic liberalism is in contradiction with what I call the politics of Chalcedon, and imitates Nestorian logic insofar as it reinforces the dualisms that Chalcedon attempts to overcome. This dualistic and binary mode of thought is most evident in the rhetoric of mutual exclusivity. What is very clear in this critique of political democratic liberalism is an us versus them, church versus world dualism. It is not anti-creation, and in this sense it is not Manichaean, but it is over and against a certain configuration of the created. What is not Christian is self-contained, bordered configuration of the created that is over and against the Christian configuration. The borders collide with each other, and the rhetorical battle is an all-out winners-take-all war. What is Christian becomes a self-identification over and against the self-contained, bordered social imaginary of the secular, such that any compromise would be a capitulation. In my own theological judgment, a Chalcedonian politics would lead to an orthodoxy that would encounter the public political space in such a way as to support a secularism as radical pluralism, the promotion of virtues that enable patterns of relationality that are theosis-like, insofar as virtue-based relationships actually do promote justice, freedom, fellowship, and love. Such a politics is generous insofar as it does not create diametrical oppositions, but sees what is good and transformable in the other. Such a politics would welcome critique as an opportunity for dialogue. Such a politics would condemn publicly all forms of violence against all minorities. And finally, the politics of theosis should lead the Orthodox churches to take stances on certain positions in the political space counterintuitive to what we are currently witnessing. To conclude, the word secular has evolved over time. No one believes anymore that religion will go away or will be eliminated. What is being contested is whether religion should be privatized, but even here, the weight of opinion in the West is that religion should have a strong voice in the public sphere. But when religion or religious institutions use their authority to shape legal structures in such a way as to limit religious pluralism and to threaten freedom and equality, then that is not the secular. And is that what Orthodox theology demands? I argue no. Orthodox theology demands a Christian secularism. We must remember that the church and the political arena are two different spaces. In the political space, we encounter the one who does not believe what we believe. We must approach such a person shaped by an ascetics of theosis, understood as a learning to love, even if that person is out to destroy what we cherish. Such a politics of theosis means that we do not force orthodoxy on anyone. A politics of theosis means that we work for legal structures and cultural practices that enable patterns of relationships that affirm the irreducible uniqueness of the citizens of a politia. There are some who might argue that a politics of theosis means to deify all of creation, including culture and politics. What we must understand, however, is that the politia is not the church. Thus, theosis of the politia can only be a reflection, an icon, an analogous image of what is possible in the church. When culture and the politia are divinized, this means that the church as a cosmic reality has been realized. Until then, the church and the politia are distinct spaces. And divine human communion possible in the politia can never be the fullness of that realized in the church. And some politias reflect this divine human communion more than others. It has always been my argument that political liberalism enables an analogous communion of persons more so than the kind of totalitarianism experienced in this region. It is very, very tempting to use the state and nationalism to secure orthodoxy's privilege in a society in the name of the deification of culture and politia. But as the well-known Orthodox theologian and my good friend Padalis Kaleatidis has argued, that is the temptation of Judas. It is not the politics of theosis to which we are all called. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to thank Professor Papanikolaou for this inspiring and interesting lecture. I believe he offered us valuable arguments and an interesting perspective regarding a relevant and popular problem of the relationship between orthodoxy and secularism. We are honored that you accepted our call to participate in this conference, and we hope to see you again in the future. Dragi prijatelji, naš simpozion i hvala Bogu ispunio naše očekivanja, ali i raspršio neke naše strepnje. Zahvaljujući učesnicima, izvanrednim predavačima, ali i vama ozbiljnim i izvanrednim i pažljivim slušalcima, od kojih ste mnogi uzeli učešće postavljajući ozbiljna i važna pitanja. Kao što naša glavna molitva počinje molitvom za mir svega svijeta, ovogodišnji simpozion počeo je govorom o miru i podrškom platformi za mir. A onda su nastavili naši gosti koji su svojim nastupom zaista zaslužili da ih sve još jednom sa zahvalnošću pomenemo. To su profesor dr. Todor Mitrović, profesor dr. Mileta Prodanović, akademik Milivoje Unković, magistar gospođa Tamara Rajković, Jelena Jeftić, profesor dr. Tomas Bremer, docent dr. Aleksandar Đakovac, iguman magistar Danilo Pavlović, dr. Marko Vilotić, gospođa Jelena Ilić, gospođa Ana Piljić-Mitrović, gospodin Milinko Milićević, profesor dr. Boris Begović, dr. Rasko Jović, magistar Nebojša Katić, dr. Andrej Jeftić, profesor dr. Miro Jakovljević, Tatjana Popović, gospođa Branka Škoro, profesor dr. Darko Đogo, profesor dr. Goran Latinović, docent dr. Vladislav Puzović, profesor dr. Bogoljub Šijaković, dr. Lazar Supić, magistar Ivan Šupić, dr. Kenan Musić, profesor dr. Vladislav Topalović, profesor dr. Mirko Sajlović, dr. Drago Perović, Dragan Davidović i na kraju uvaženi profesor sa Fordham univerziteta iz Njujorka, dr. Aristotel Papanikolaou. Molim vas da ih još jednom srdačno pozdravim. Na kraju, da još jednom podsjetim da naši simpozioni nemaju namjeru niti pretenziju da na postavljene teme ponude konačna rješenja, nego da važna i izazovna pitanja savremenog svijeta tematizuju i da otvore dijalog sa teologijom u kojem ćemo se najvećim međusobnim uvažavanjem učiti jedni od drugih i tako se svi zajedno duhovno obogaćivati. Slaveći Boga što nas je stvorio takvima da naše talente ne koristimo na destruktivan način, nego ugledajući se na svoga Tvorca, isključivo čovjekoljubivo, tako da sa ovakvih susreta izađemo sa više znanja, ali i međusobnog poštovanja i djelotvornije ljubavi. Zato, prije svega, moramo da se zahvalimo i onima bez kojih bi bilo teško organizovati ovakav jedan naučni skup i prijateljski skup. To je prije svega Republika Srpska sa Ministarstvom prosvjete i kulture, Republički sekretarijat za vjere Banja Luke, Republika Srbija isto ministarstvo, Federalno ministarstvo za obrazovanje i nauke iz Mostara, grad Trebinje, hidroelektrana na Trebišnici, Elektroprivreda Republike Srpske, rudnik i termoelektrana Gacko, Kulturni centar Trebinje, u kome sad stojimo, sjedimo, Muzej Hercegovine Trebinje, organizacije World Vision, USAID i CRS, Bankom grupa, EFT grupa, Dom učenika Trebinje, Hotel Platani, Štamparija Print Shop, Hotel Vila Marija, Hotel Central i Hotel Leotard. Svima njima neizmjerna zahvalnost na dobroti i naravno u stilu savremene kulture da se zahvalimo onima koje obično zaboravimo. A to su ovi mladići koji su po cijeli dan trčali okolo da donesu kafu, vodu, sok, da otvore vrata, da uzmu nekome kaput i molim vas da i njih pozdravite. Svima vam je jasno da svake godine neko treba da podnese najveći teret. Kao i prošle godine, ove godine nismo našli bolju zamjenu, nismo napravili neki uspješniji transfer. To je bio gospodin Marko Vilotić koji je za sada i dalje naš najbolji igrač na sredini terena. Tu je pored njega odmah, ali je bio pod velikim obavezama u inostranstvu, ali nas je pratio svim srcem i svom dušom, Andrej Jeftić i naravno naš otac Vladan Perišić koji nas stalno kritikuje, ali nam ne da da se opustimo. Neka Bog blagoslovi svaki vaš napor usmjeren ka boljem razumijevanju i većem poštovanju svih ljudi sa kojima ćete, napuštajući ovaj naš Trebinjski simposion, naš mali grad, doći u susret. Hvala vam svima.